Namaste, and welcome to our continuing series on the life divine with our beloved Ranga. We continue chapter 24, Matter, page 250, beginning with the first main paragraph.
Again, as usual, I'll say what he has said in the previous para so that we get the continuity. But these are my own words, simpler words instead of sort of resume-like. Let us return to the origin and source of all things to understand better the principles of things. He's trying to understand what is matter. Existence, which is another word for it is substance and being, when active, is a consciousness and a force. Existence uses the force to make forms and present them to consciousness that enjoys them. To put it otherwise, Sat Chit Ananda creates forms out of itself, into itself, and seeing them enjoys its own products. Force, which is active energy of conscious substance, produces things which are really nothing but forms of consciousness force. Substance, which becomes matter, is therefore spirit molding itself into forms. The divided appearance of these forms to our normal physical view is due to the dividing action of the universal mind. Life is a representation of conscious force. Mind we know to be an inferior power of supermind. Matter is the final result of the working of conscious being or Sat. So, we may say that matter is substance of Satchidananda divided by universal mind, but only phenomenally. The division is only apparent. The individual mind repeats this division and dwells in it. But the real indivisibility is never abrogated and remains always intact.
Excellent.
This is what he is saying.
Very good.
So now we go to this new para. But why this phenomenal and pragmatic division of an indivisible existence? It is because mind has to carry the principle of multiplicity to its extreme potential, which can only be done by separativeness and division. To do that, it must, precipitating itself into life to create forms for the multiple, give to the universal principle of being the appearance of a gross and material substance instead of a pure or subtle substance. It must, that is to say, give it the appearance of substance which offers itself to the contact of mind as a stable thing or object in an abiding multiplicity of objects, and not of substance which offers itself to the contact of pure consciousness as something of its own eternal pure existence and reality, or to subtle sense as a principle of plastic form freely expressive of the conscious being. The contact of mind with its objects creates what we call sense. But here it has to be an obscure, externalized sense which must be assured of the reality of what it contacts. The descent of pure substance into material substance follows then, inevitably, on the descent of Satchidananda through supermind into mind and life. It is a necessary result of the will to make multiplicity of being and an awareness of things from separate centers of consciousness, the first method of this lower experience of existence. If we go back to the spiritual basis of things, substance in its utter purity resolves itself into pure conscious being, self-existent, inherently self-aware, by identity, but not yet turning its consciousness upon itself as object. Supermind preserves this self-awareness by identity as its substance of self-knowledge and its light of self-creation. But for that creation, but for that creation presents being to itself as the subject object, one and multiple of its own active consciousness. Being as object is held there in a supreme knowledge which can, by comprehension, see it both as an object of cognition within itself and subjectively as itself, but can also and simultaneously, by apprehension, project it as an object or objects of cognition within the circumference of its consciousness, not other than itself, part of its being, but a part or parts put away from itself, that is to say, from the center of vision in which being concentrates itself as the knower, witness, or Purusha. We have seen that from this apprehending consciousness arises the movement of mind, the movement of which the individual knower regards a form of his own universal being as if other than he. But in the divine mind, there is immediately, or rather simultaneously, another movement or reverse side of the same movement, an act of union in being which heals this phenomenal division and prevents it from becoming, even for a moment, solely real to the knower. This act of conscious union is that which is represented otherwise in the dividing mind, obtusely, ignorantly, quite externally, as contact in consciousness between divided beings and separate objects. And with us, this contact in divided consciousness is primarily represented by the principle of sense. On this basis of sense, on this contact of union, subject to division, the action of the thought mind founds itself and prepares for the return to a higher principle of union in which division is made subject to unity and subordinate. Substance then, as we know it, material substance, is the form in which mind, acting through sense, contacts the conscious being of which it is itself a movement of knowledge. Very complex.
Very complex.
We'll try to.
We'll spend the evening on this one paragraph.
Yes, absolutely. Because even when you're reading it, you have to go very carefully, look at each word and see what is the connection and try and understand.
Yes.
We'll see whether we can do that. Okay. It's difficult. We can do one thing. We can have an overview of this para and then we'll go in detail. That may be a good idea. We'll get the basic idea and then we'll go into details.
Excellent.
So, I'll tell you in essence what he's saying in the para. Then we go back sentence by sentence. So what he's saying in this para, he's discussing the question, but why this division into multiplicity of that which is indivisible, even if this division is only phenomenal, practical, and not ultimately real? It is because the one wishes to become the many, and this is possible only through separation and division. So, the process begins by mind plunging into life one step lower into the manifestation so that life may create infinite living creatures. And it does this by making its pure substance, sat, gross, material, capable of clear, well-defined, stable forms. Impelled by life, matter takes substantial forms and offers these to the witnessing mind for its enjoyment. Pure substance is for consciousness its own being. Pure substance becomes subtle substance or plastic forms for mind. Pure substance becomes gross material forms for mind, the manas. mind contacting its own created forms is sense. Just think about that. When mind is contacting created things, it is sense that is allowing it to contact. Pure substance descending into gross matter is the result of Satchidananda descending through supermind, overmind, into mind and life. This process is the result of Chit Shakti wanting to experience creation through multiple centers of awareness instead of merely one. He wants to see in different ways. In its origin, supermind, pure substance, is itself consciousness and force, without these turning into subject and object. All three are one single entity. Substance, consciousness and force are one single thing. Okay? All three are one single entity. The supermind can be only one subject object, or it can become subject viewing itself as object within itself. This capacity heals the apparent division in the multiplicity of the physical world. We may then define matter as a form of pure substance presenting itself to mind through sense for its enjoyment. Slightly easier perhaps, but equally.
Still complex.
It's pretty complex. Okay, without reading all these things, what we can say is that Satchidananda is a substance. It's a conscious substance, and it has got force also in it, and it wants to create out of its own substance. It is creating things. And why is it creating things? It wants to create and enjoy. So consciousness is telling its own force, use my substance which is me and make forms for me to enjoy. This is in simple language, this is what it is. And so force does that. Force, under the guidance of consciousness, produces forms. If consciousness were not guiding force, force would create randomly. It would be a random creation. He says this again and again. So consciousness is knowledge. So when knowledge is there, it is guiding force, otherwise mechanical force will go on producing things helter-skelter. So consciousness is guiding, make things in an orderly manner and a connected and meaningful manner. That's what it is doing.
Then does it through mind.
Yes. And when it is doing that, it has to do it through mind, because mind is the principle that makes one the many. It is mind that divides. You see, it plays the role of a prism, like we had discussed yesterday. That one thing comes and splits up into multiplicity and infinite multiplicity. The potential for multiplicity is there in the supermind, but in the overmind, it becomes a dynamic potentiality. Potentiality. Inherent potentiality, if you want, or passive potentiality and dynamic potentiality. Then from there, once the thing starts, infinite divisions. And for each thing in the physical world, there is an archetype in the overmind, which he calls the real idea. I'm going a little ahead, but he calls the real idea. So, a real idea is something like if an architect wants to make a building, he has a plan first. He draws up a blueprint, and then he executes it and makes it into a reality. So everything in the physical world which are realities, which are actualities, there's a corresponding archetype, and that's a blueprint for everything is planned already there, and it becomes a reality here in the physical world. Okay? Now we try to go back and see sentence by sentence whether it makes any sense. This is a difficult chapter. I told you it's a difficult chapter.
But now we get back to my old question.
Yes.
The Holocaust was planned?
Yes, because it is one of the possibilities. It is, again I come back to that one basic thing. This is a very important point, one has to understand it perfectly well. When the divine is creating one thing, he doesn't create only a limited range, he creates a whole range. Suppose he is creating wind, okay? I'll take up light afterwards. So he creates wind of the intensest possible
Force.
force. And he also creates the softest and the sweetest and the gentlest of wind. So at our level, we find objection to the hard and the strong, and we find the soft very pleasant. At our level, we have soft and we have pleasant and unpleasant, good and evil. But for the divine, there is no such thing as good and evil, or there is no such thing as, it is only intense and soft, hard and soft. The whole range he is creating. Suppose he is creating light. He creates not one light, but only intense lights and less light, and doesn't stop at no light. It goes into darkness also, negative. If you have mathematics, you have the plus infinity and the minus infinity. So the darkness is only absence of light. So the Holocaust exactly is again the same thing. It's an intense force in that nature. For him it is intense force. It manifests itself in that way.
But you could say darkness is also just diminution of light.
Yes, that's right. So this, or it could be the extra, the force is intense that side. The Holocaust would fall into that category. So for him, it is only intense force and less force. And that is the reason why also when you go into the higher mind level, virtue and sin are basically vibrations. More vibration, less vibration. There is, for the spiritual man, there is no difference between virtue and sin. This is same. Just like we come back to the quality of lights, okay? There is the frequency of the light determines the quality of light. So many megahertz, you have red. So many, little less, you have yellow. So he is creating the whole range, but ultimately they are all only vibration of a certain length. The same thing also with your sin and virtue. Virtue is at a vibrational length. Sin, in the agenda very clearly, Mother has said that, very, very clearly, that it is only, both are vibrations at the same level. Only you see it as different because you like to see things in opposites, in dualities. There are no dualities at the higher level of consciousness. There is only oneness.
Excellent.
Okay, so but why this phenomenal and pragmatic division of an indivisible existence? Satchidananda is Satchit Ananda, but it's absolutely one. It's not very easy for the mind to understand that, but substance, consciousness, force and Ananda are really one. They cannot be divided. They are absolutely one. But it is being divided phenomenal. The word phenomenal is the opposite of something which is static, noumenon. Phenomenon is starting point, ending point, transience. Its nature is transience. It takes birth and dies. It is something transient, phenomenal. And pragmatic, practical. Division of an indivisible existence. Why at all does it do that? So now he is explaining. It is because mind has to carry the principle of multiplicity to its extreme potential, which can only be done by separativeness and division. Then we may also ask the question, why does mind have to carry the principle of multiplicity to its extreme? Because the one wants to become the many. Why? He wants to look at reality. We should be very clear about this, that at our level of consciousness, it is impossible to give a satisfactory logical answer to this. But we can, with some play of imagination, give some answer, but which logically will not be tenable. The only answer we can get only at the higher level. This is something we have to understand. So, for instance, at the animal level, there is a fundamental limitation of consciousness. It can't create music. It can't create computers. It can't. It can never can. Nor can it do yoga. There is a fundamental limitation of consciousness at the animal level. Carry that also into the human level. We also have fundamental limitations of the mind. So you cannot understand certain questions. It is impossible to understand God at the mental level. To understand Him, you have to go to the higher level. But still, you can give yourself some answers which are not logical, but which by extension of consciousness or extension of imagination, you can console yourself and say, yes, I can begin to understand. So, the one wants to become the many. Why? Because he wants to see from many, many angles. He doesn't want to see only from one angle. Okay? So he creates, all of us, he creates different, and that also from the lowest level, from the atoms. Infinite number of atoms, slowly, slowly the consciousness rises, and at human levels, 7.5 billion now, he wants to see the world that he has created from every different angle and see how it looks. So you are the divine looking at what you have created, and from your angle, I am also the divine looking at what I have created through another angle. 7.5 billion angles. This is because this is there, he has not said that here, but it is very clear in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Eko ham, I am one. Bahusyam, let me be many. This is in the Taittiriya Upanishad. So that's what he's saying here. So many if you want to be, you have to divide. And which is the principle of division? Which is the instrument that divides? Mind.
Mind. Yeah.
But mind is not our mind, but the overmind. Supermind and overmind does that work. Supermind does it, you can say in a way, theoretically. Overmind does it practically. You can put it that way. These words are all, you have to be careful, because if you challenge, then obviously it can be challenged. Theoretically means potentially it is there. The one, the many are both potentially there, but at the overmind level it becomes absolutely a reality, and each thing is given the right to express itself fully along its own lines in the physical world. And therefore you have opposites. That's why we have dualities in the physical world. Okay? It is because mind has to carry the principle of multiplicity to its extreme potential, which can only be done by separativeness and division. To do that, it must, precipitating itself into life to create forms for the multiple, give to the universal principle of being. Universal principle of being is again the substance. Universal principle of being is sat or existence. Same. Being, existence and substance. Basically the same meaning. Okay? To do that, it must, precipitating its life to create forms of the multiple, give to the principle, a universal principle of being, the appearance of a gross and material substance instead of a pure and subtle substance. The pure and subtle substance can be one, but gross and divided substance will be the many. That which is pure and subtle, there is no division there. So it has to become division, it has to become gross. Alright? Yeah. Appearance of a gross and material substance instead of a pure and subtle substance. Note the word also pure. When it comes here, the purity disappears, it takes different forms. What is meant by pure? If something is pure, any 2 points, it will be the same. There will be no difference. There will be perfect homogeneity. That is purity. If there is heterogeneity, then it is not pure. If 2 points are different, there is a mixture. So that's what I meant by pure. So you think of that substance which is pure means everywhere it's the same. In other words, you can use the word oneness. There is no duality there. Okay? So it must, that is to say, given the appearance of substance which offers itself to the contact of mind, a stable thing or object in an abiding multiplicity of objects, and not of substance which offers itself to the contact of pure consciousness as something of its own eternal pure existence and reality, or to subtle sense as a principle of plastic form, freely expressive of the conscious being. He is talking of 3 levels here.
Mm-hmm.
He is talking of 3 levels.
Yes.
So, the first level is,
it has to give the appearance of substance.
offers itself to the contact as something, it is not, it begins from there. Not substance which offers itself to the contact of pure consciousness as something of its own eternal pure existence. Because at that time they are the same. Pure consciousness and pure substance are the same. So there is no division. It can't be that. It has to come down to a subtle sense level and then gross sense level. So at the subtle sense level, he is saying, as something of its own eternal pure existence and reality, or to subtle sense as a principle of plastic form freely expressive of the conscious being. So, for instance, at our vital level and our mental level, the substance is subtle. In Indian philosophy, we say that if you are mentally you are thinking of let's say you are thinking of a mountain, the mental substance will take the form of a mountain. If I have telepathic sight, I can look into your mind and I can say you are thinking of a mountain, because your mental substance takes that form. It is subtle substance, but it takes a form. That's why thoughts have forms, thoughts have colors. Those who see.
Oh, yes.
Mother once remarked about Jugal Kishore Mukherjee. She said that his thinking is extremely clear because the thought forms that came out of his mind were sharp and well defined. If it is hazy, then thinking is unclear. So she had praised him a lot, because when he was playing Perseus the Deliverer on the stage, 1952 or 1953, Mother said that his thinking is so clear. She had remarked about that.
Who is?
Jugal Kishore Mukherjee. He was in charge of knowledge for a long time.
He is the one they said could give you the page of anything in Sri Aurobindo's works.
Yeah. He had read Sri Aurobindo very, very thoroughly. He had read perfectly, and he knew from the mental point of view, he was one of the best. He was fantastic. He was my teacher also, and I used to go to him for a lot of discussions and all that. He would make things very clear about the principles of this life. He was very clear on that. Yeah. So mental substance is subtle. Vital substance also is subtle. It also takes forms and colors. But when it comes down to matter, your body is a gross substance. So vital substance and mental substance is subtle but mixed. When you go to the highest level, it is pure substance and pure consciousness. There is no difference. So there is a pure, there is a slightly subtle which is mixed, not so pure, and finally at the physical level, gross substance, which takes clear forms. 3 levels he is talking about here. Okay? Then, principle of plastic form, freely expressive of the conscious being. The contact of mind with its objects creates what we call sense. Now, my mind has to see the object outside. How does it do that? Nature provides you with senses. If the senses are not there, you will not be able to contact any object outside. So the sense is the instrument of knowledge at our level for knowing the created thing. As you keep going higher and higher in consciousness, these instruments of knowledge go on changing. Gross senses become subtle senses. Subtle senses become sight, only sight. Then, even at a higher level, you have intuition. Intuition is not thought, but simply light that comes like a drop of light into your mind and you know the reality. Finally, the instrument of knowledge becomes identification. So you become what you want to know. Interestingly, when you have identification at the highest level, subject and object become one. At our level, if I am the subject and I want to know the object in the physical world, there is something that needs to connect me. But subject and object are different, so I need instruments of connection. So that's why senses come in. That's how he's defining sense. But
any sense.
Yeah, any sense. 3, 4 senses, 5 senses.
Right.
They are the ones that contact me with the physical world. At the subtle sense, very easy example, when you are dreaming, you are seeing and you are hearing. But you are not using your eyes nor your ears. So that is subtle sight and subtle sense. That is when you are dreaming, but when you are dreaming, you are not conscious. You can consciously go into your intraconscious and subtle senses can operate there. Okay? Then we go to the next sentence. But here, that means in the physical world, it has to be an obscure, externalized sense which must be assured of the reality of what it contacts. So you have gross senses. So, but here means in the physical world, it has to be an obscure, externalized sense, that means gross sense, which must be assured of the reality of what it contacts.
Why does he say obscure?
In the sense that it is not subtle,
Okay.
in that sense. Light is subtle and obscurity is dense. In that sense, he is using the word, I suppose. Okay? The descent of pure substance into material substance follows then, inevitably, on the descent of Satchidananda through supermind into mind and life. So, when the multiplicity has to take place, subtle substance comes down into gross substance, but it is coming down through supermind and finally from mind and life. So it descends from its original status of Satchidananda, substance comes down into supermind, plunges into mind, plunges into life, and tells life to create forms for itself and creates forms in the physical world. This is not difficult to understand, very easy to understand what he's saying. It is a necessary result of the will to make multiplicity of being and an awareness of things from separate centers of consciousness. So, as I said, we are all separate centers of consciousness, but we can carry this sense of separateness and centers of consciousness right down to the animal level even. There also, even the worm is seeing from its own sense, it is seeing, contacting the world. So it starts from that level. It need not be only at our level. As you give, even animals are contacting from their own point of view, they are seeing the experiencing the physical world.
Is it the will or the mind that does this? Because he says here it has to be the result of the will to make multiplicity of being.
Will at the highest level. The will
okay.
at that level. He's saying it's a necessary result of the will to make multiplicity of being and an awareness of things from separate centers of consciousness. He's talking about the will of the Satchidananda.
Okay.
That will creates all this. Okay? So, if we go back to the spiritual basis of things, substance in its utter purity resolves itself into pure conscious being. So, if we go back to the spiritual basis of things, means Satchidananda, substance in its utter purity resolves itself into pure conscious being, self-existent, inherently self-aware by identity. So, it exists by itself. It doesn't need anything to create it. It is self-existent. In the physical world, there is a cause for everything that is created. But there it is self-existent. It exists by itself. So, inherently self-aware by identity. So, this substance which is there is conscious. He is repeating the same thing. It is conscious and it's got its own force. If we go back to the spiritual basis of things, substance in its purity, substance in purity becomes sat, existence. They use the word existence of being. Okay. Inherently self-aware by identity, but not yet turning its consciousness upon itself as object. There you are. So, consciousness and substance are one, but at that highest level, it is not yet turning its consciousness onto objects, which is creating. At the highest level, they are all one. There is no subject, no object. It's all one. But as soon as you come down to the supramental level, consciousness separates itself. This is not here, it's elsewhere. Consciousness separates itself from force and tells it to create forms. But this process is within itself. That's why he uses the words comprehending consciousness and apprehending consciousness. Comprehending consciousness, many in the one. Apprehending consciousness, the one in the many. Okay? So, when there is no division, it's a comprehensive consciousness. Comprehending consciousness. And when the one enters into the many, that is the apprehending consciousness. He will discuss that. So, if we go back to the spiritual basis of things, substance in its utter purity resolves itself into pure conscious being, self-existent, inherently self-aware by identity, but not yet turning its consciousness upon itself as object. Okay? There is no object and subject there. It's only subject if you want to. There is no object there.
He covers it a little later, though, in this.
Pardon?
He speaks of it later in this
Yes.
paragraph.
Yes. Then he says, supermind preserves this self-awareness by identity as a substance of self-knowledge and its light of self-creation. Supermind is fully aware of itself. It is self-awareness, preserves its self-awareness by identity as a substance of self-knowledge. All these substance, knowledge, consciousness, everything is one at that highest level. As a substance of self-knowledge and its light of self-creation. The light of self-creation also is power, if you can think of it as power. The power to create something is power. So, light of self-creation, he is putting in another way, it is power with consciousness in it, because it is light. But for that, creation presents being to itself as a subject-object, one and multiple of its own active consciousness. So, if you use your imagination, in the supermind, consciousness says, okay, my force, now I want to see you separate from myself, but within myself, and start using your power to create forms so that I can enjoy the forms. I am putting it in a very understandable manner at our level, but this is the process that is there. Okay, so object, multiple of zone. Being as object, now being has become object, is held there in a supreme knowledge which can, by comprehension, there you are. So, the consciousness and force has separated itself, but all within itself, because there is nothing else outside Satchidananda. Satchidananda is the whole thing, that's the only thing that exists. So, therefore, even this so-called separation is happening within itself, not outside itself. So, by comprehension, see it both as an object of cognition within itself and subjectively as itself. So, when it is creating something, it's like Narad writes poems. So, the poem is part of you and also it is separate from you. Exactly in the same way. You can see it as my own expression, or it is also, you can see it as separate from yourself. Sremda uses this for Shakespeare. Yeah.
Yes.
This is the first thing, that what is there within you only you are bringing out and seeing it as part of you as well as separate from you. That's what is there. As an object of cognition within itself and subjectively as itself, but can also and simultaneously by apprehension project it as an object or objects of cognition within the circumference of its consciousness, not other than itself, part of its being, but part of parts put away from itself. In the beginning, it is just creating very near to itself. You can think it is part of me and also separate from me. Now it pushes it a little farther away and says, you are still me, but you are separate also. And he's using the word within the circumference of his consciousness. So now that thing which was one, there is a circle and a circumference is coming. Or within itself. It is one yet many. Okay, then by apprehension projected as an object or objects of cognition within the circumference of its own consciousness, not other than itself, part of its being, but part or parts put away from itself, that is to say, from the center of vision in which being concentrates itself as the knower, witness or Purusha. So now that consciousness becomes the knower and there is something which it has created which becomes to be known. So there is the object and the subject, but within itself. Okay, so we have seen that from this apprehending consciousness arises the movement of mind, the movement which the individual knower regards a form of his own universal being as if other than he. So this is exactly like the poet and the creation of the poet. He sees it as other than he. Okay. I read that again. we have seen that from this apprehending consciousness, in which each separateness is there, arises the movement of mind, the movement by which the individual knower, now it has become the individual knower, not the universal knower. It has become the individual knower. The individual knower regards the form of his own universal being as if other than he. But in the divine mind, there is immediately or rather simultaneously another movement or reverse side of the same movement, an act of union in being which heals this phenomenal division and prevents it from becoming, even for a moment, solely real to the knower. So, there is a division and yet there is no division. That's basically what he's saying. There are two movements are there. Something separate and there is a sense of unity also. And even in the physical world, we have this sense of separateness and unity. Examples are very easy to understand. Species. Species are all different. Many are there and yet there is something common to all of them. That's a unity and there's multiplicity. Both are there. All species, all collectivities are of that nature. There is a unity and there is a separateness. It starts at that level and comes down here and becomes separate. There the unity is more obvious. Here the multiplicity is more obvious. But unity is there in the background. And multiplicity is more obvious. But at that highest level, unity is more obvious and multiplicity is a lesser reality there. Then, this act of conscious union is that which is represented otherwise in dividing mind obtusely, ignorantly, quite externally as contact in consciousness between divided beings and separate objects. And with us, this contact in divided consciousness is primarily represented by the principle of sense. When sense comes in, it makes you feel separate. Okay? On this basis of sense, on this contact of union subject to division, the action of the thought mind founds itself and prepares for the return to a higher principle of union, in which division is made subject to unity and subordinate. There you are. So division is made subject to unity and subordinate. Substance then, this is the third definition. Substance then, as we know it, material substance, now we're not talking of pure substance, but material substance, is the form in which mind acting through sense contacts the conscious being, of which it is itself a movement of knowledge. He has gone into great detail, but essentially, if you want, you make it very simple and maybe illogical. Satchidananda is one. Sat, Chit, Shakti, Ananda separate themselves at the superman level, and consciousness is telling force, start creating forms out of substance, my own substance, create forms so that I can enjoy what is being done. And the multiplicity comes in. And create forms infinitely, don't stop. So infinite forms are created. And when you silence your mind and go to the self, you become the witness of that. You start seeing the witness, you become the sakshi.
In the yoga and its objects, he speaks about that.
Yeah.
He speaks about the second part is to become the witness.
Yes.
Looking at yourself.
Yes. And witness means there is no power. You are just watching. You have knowledge, but you have no power. You are just watching. If you want the power, you have to go even higher up. You can't, at the level of the higher mind, you have knowledge, you have the sense of oneness, you start seeing oneness. But you see the world as separate from you and you don't have any power to do anything about it. You see your own nature. If you had some bad habits or good habits, they will continue in the body-mind life and you will be watching, but you are not judgmental. You are just watching. They are realities, they are actualities. Without good and bad, you are just watching. That's why that is a witness. The witness doesn't judge, he just watches. There is no judgment.
Yes.
And very often that's why the image of the witness is given as a camera. The camera sees without emotion. It just records the actuality. That's what the witness consciousness is. You just see the reality without judgment. Discrimination is there, but no judgment. You can see difference, but you don't judge. This is good, that is bad. No. You just watch things.
Well, Ranga, we've completed about 20% of the life divine. We have 80% to go, and we thank you for enlightening us so
I don't
wonderfly.
know.
Thank you.
We are trying our best. Yes, collectively, we are trying to understand.